Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, let's talk about lipless crankbaits and why they are one of my favorite baits for the fall. Lipless crankbaits are actually this is one of my boxes of lipless crankbaits right here. I kind of separate them in shad patterns and also crawfish patterns. I've got a whole other box that has just all my reds and crawfish and bluegill patterns. Man, lipless crankbaits, I feel like I tend to get away from lipless crankbaits once you get warmer water. And so summertime, late spring, summertime, those are really, times of the year that oftentimes I'll just leave the lipless crankbait boxes at home, which probably is a mistake because they work all year round. But these baits right here, they've got a few qualities that make them really good for colder water situations. But for the fall, which we're not necessarily talking about really cold water at this point, I like reaching for lipless crankbaits for a different reason. But let's talk about some of the qualities of a lipless crankbait that make it really good for, cold water situations first, and then we'll get into why I like it in the fall, which again, we're not necessarily talking about ultra cold water. Sometimes it's still pretty warm. So a lipless crankbait, by definition, is exactly what it sounds like. It doesn't have a lip like a traditional crankbait does. So it's not designed to really, dive down to a certain depth. It's actually easily controllable to fish in any depth. In fact, I've fished lipless crankbaits sometimes, yo-yoing it in really deep water, 30 feet plus. When I'm targeting fish in those deep ledges and things like that, especially here on the Tennessee River, because they sink. Pretty much all the lipless crankbaits. There are a few exceptions. There's some that are designed to float, but I generally don't fish those ones very much. But most of them will sink. Some sink like a rock, some have a controlled sink, some actually make a nice little shimmy on the fall, which I think is really, really good, especially if you are fishing it in some type of yo-yo technique. But you can fish these at any depth zone. You just need to adjust the speed that you're retrieving it at, the size of the line that you're fishing with it, and all of those different things. And so you could fish it at any depth. It's designed to have a very, very tight wobble, and most of them will make quite a bit of noise. Now this one right here is a one knocker, so it's got one big rattle in there. So if I shake it, you can hear that rattle. A little bit more subtle. It still makes quite a bit of noise underwater, but it's not quite as bold, I think, as a traditional, say, good old original rattle trap, if I can get one out. You listen to that, I mean, that is a ton of noise. That's just a bunch of BBs in there that create a pretty pronounced rattle. So there's a lot of different sounds that you can get, and really what I've found is that I tend to experiment with the different sounds. So I try a lot of different sounding lipless crankbaits in different scenarios and find which one the fish actually prefer. So, but in general, lipless crankbaits designed so you can fish them in all depth zones. They have a tight wobble, okay? So they do put off a lot of vibration, but they've got a tight side-to-side action, and they work really good in vegetation. That's why, like, submergent grass, especially if it's nice, fresh, green, and crispy, hydrilla or milfoil, it will actually rip through it pretty darn well. So this is the original chatterbait in my mind when it comes to like that early spring, submergent grass type scenario where a lot of people are throwing lipless crankbaits nowadays, or chatterbaits nowadays. It used to be that lipless crankbait was kind of the undefeated champion of that scenario. So let's talk about why I like it in the fall, because that kind of explains why I like it in the colder months, is because it has that tight wobble. It has that, and I think that that baits that generally have a tighter wobble are better in the colder months, just because, you know, most of the bait fish are going to have a more subdued action to it. But the reason why I like a lipless crankbait in the fall is because the bulkiness is eliminated with this type of bait, okay? And a lot of times it's really hard to be able to match the hatch with different types of baits, okay? You know, and with a lipless crankbait, they make 1/4 ounce versions that are really, you know, pretty small. And then they make 1/2 ounce versions, 5/8 versions. They make 3/4 ounce versions. And during the fall, especially, I see scenarios where fish are really, really focused on small bait fish, or I shouldn't even say just small bait fish, because it really depends on the lake and the creek that you're in. But the fish are hyper focused on whatever size shad are in the backs of the creeks that you're fishing, okay? And so it's super important this time of year to match the hatch. That's why you see a lot of videos that I'm doing this time of year. I'm throwing that Z-Man minnows, that little, you know, 3-inch swim bait. Sometimes I'll cut it down a little bit. The reason for that is because that's about the only thing that they'll eat, because it's one of the best options to be able to match the hatch. But a lipless crankbait is also in that category as well, because you can get a bait that is nice and small. You can still work it in a bunch of different depth zones, and you can, or, you know, I keep saying small on Chickamauga. Most of the time, I'm trying to match the hatch of like tiny little bait fish. But I've seen on places like Guntersville where you need to have, like, you know, gizzard shad size baits as well. And so sometimes they'll be running like the 3/4 ounce versions for that. And even 1 ounce, they have 1 ounce versions. So they get pretty big. But that's one of the reasons why I like throwing a lipless crankbait, is because the profile is so realistic. You look at this thing, you lay it right next to a threadfin shad, it looks exactly like a threadfin shad. There's no, you know, a big billowing, you know, skirt that kind of bulks it up a little bit too much. There's really no extra appendages to it. There's no bill that maybe takes away from the overall profile and adds to the size of the bait. You know, it's just the shape of a shad. And so it's really, really effective. And another thing that a lipless crankbait does really good any time of the year is fishing on flats. So areas where the depth range really doesn't change all that much. A lipless crankbait is a great fan casting presentation, where you just make one long cast, another long cast, and you just kind of work, you know, like a lawn sprinkler, you know, and just kind of cover a large area. And this time of year, the shad are back there in these major feeder creeks, and you're just trying to locate where those schools of shad are and where those bass are. And so they may not stay in one location. They kind of shift along in those flats. And a lipless crankbait is a great way to be able to cover a lot of water, you know, and you know, keep picking fish off on these flats as they move around. And so you can fish them really, really dirt shallow, you know, especially if you get to like a 1/4 ounce version, or you upsize your line, you can actually, you know, fish a foot of water, or 1.5 feet, 2 foot of water very, very efficiently. And just overall, that's one of the main reasons why I like throwing lipless crankbaits this time of year. You know, if that's the type of thing that I'm targeting. You know, obviously there's other bites going on this time of year. You know, in the fall on the TVA, there's a lot of fish on the main lake still, current-oriented fish. They're focused more on gizzard shad and things like that. And this may not be my number one presentation, but if I'm in the backs of creeks, I would say this has got to be a top 3 presentation for those fish that are focused on those big schools of shad that have kind of made their way into the backs of those creeks. And then eventually they'll start making their way back out towards the main lake, and I'll still use a lipless crankbait, especially in the winter and early pre-spawn. Those are key periods in time. So from October all the way until, you know, the very end of the pre-spawn, a lipless crankbait is definitely going to be one of my #1 choices. Now, a couple things to remember about a lipless crankbait. Always keep sharp hooks on these baits. I use the TBL 930s from Hayabusa on these. And some of the lipless crankbaits are really good because most lipless crankbaits actually, you can upsize your hooks. You don't really have to worry about dulling the action of them by, putting a size, 2s on there versus, size 4s or something like that. So sometimes I'll upsize the hook. Sometimes I'll keep them the same. It just really depends on the scenario and how well those fish are eating it. That's one thing you want to keep in mind. Another thing is, vary the size of your line. I use anywhere from 12-pound if I'm trying to get it deeper, all the way up to 20-pound test to, keep it shallow, or if I'm ripping it through grass or things like that. And then I use a 7-foot 3-inch medium heavy Versa Series rod. And generally, unless I'm really trying to slow roll this bait, which I don't do a lot really, I use a 7.2-to-1 gear ratio VLD 10 reel. So I'll put all of the tackle that I just mentioned in the description below. If you use those links to purchase anything, you'll get 10% off your order, and it helps support the channel. So consider using that, which takes you to 44 tackle. They've got a great selection. So I'll give you some suggestions as far as lipless crankbait gear that I like for fall fishing right now in the description below. But anyways, guys, killer bait has to be tied on your rods anytime you're fishing in the fall, and really it should be kept on your rods from here all the way through the pre-spawn. Okay, and the only thing that really changes is the colors that are going to be more advantageous as we get into pre-spawn. Once we get past the fall, there's a period where I'll still use shad, but then it starts transitioning into browns and then reds and things like that really target those fish that are focused on crawfish. So anyways, guys, hopefully this helps you. Go out there, catch some lipless crankbait fish. It's a fun technique that helps you cover a lot of water, and it's so super versatile. So thank you for watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and above all, trust the process. I'll see you out on the water.